It always rains in Bergen, so they say anyway, and especially it rains on a Sunday afternoon. Bergen on a wet Sunday afternoon is a byword in Norwegian folklore, just as Manchester is in ours. There's a story of a disconsolate American tourist who stopped a little boy in the street here and said, "Say, does it always rain in Bergen?" And the little boy thought about it, and then he gravely replied, "I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm only 7 years old." But even on the quietest, wettest and most deserted Sunday, there's always one flurry of excitement at 3 o'clock every afternoon of the week, every week of the year. That's when the Bergen coastal steamer to the north and back arrives at the end of its 12-day run of 2,500 miles. Bergen is the anchor for this remarkable run, one of the most romantic trips in the world, a journey to the land of the midnight sun. And that's where I'm heading for now. Home. Home for the next 12 days. I reckon I'm going to be all right here. I've been comfortable in a lot worse places. This is a sight better than the Woolwich Ferry, anyway. These are very substantial ships, these vessels of the Coastal Express, and they need to be too, because although the summer run can be a very pleasant holiday cruise, the winter weather can really be diabolical up some of these exposed stretches of the western Norwegian coast. Each of these 13 ships is about 2,000 tons or over. They can take 450 passengers, and they actually sleep 200 of them, and sleep them very comfortably too. Actually, I'm luckier than most because the owner usually stays in this stateroom, and he's not sailing this time, thank goodness. There's another minor hazard about living in Norway, and that's this question of drinking. In the first place, there are no pubs in Norway in the accepted English sense of the term.
Sure.
They're just restaurants with bars in them. In the second place, the licensing laws themselves seem to me to be absurdly illogical, even to someone fairly familiar with the licensing laws of Scotland. You see, on a Sunday evening like tonight, there's no earthly point in ordering anything harder than beer. You can order beer, you can order table wines, but you can't have brandy, you can't have whiskey, you can't have gin. And this is because the licensing laws at present forbid you to sell or serve spirits on holidays or on the day before holidays. And since every Sunday's a holiday, that's your whole weekend fixed. Now, some people say the reason for this is that the Scandinavians are prone to drink too much. And as a Scandinavian myself, I find this a gross libel. But the result of it is one of these extraordinary compromises with prohibition that's looked nonsensical. The result also is that you can spend all weekend filling up with beer and sherry, but you can't get a good, straight, clean dram of whiskey for love or money. Now, there is a third minor hazard about drinking in Norway, because on the weekdays when you are allowed to buy spirits, you can only buy them in the state monopoly stores. And this is fine in the big towns where there are state monopoly stores, but in some of the smaller towns up north, there aren't any. And that means that in some of the towns that we'll be visiting on this tour, you have to order all your liquor from towns further south, and they all come up on this boat. And as a result, you find groups of interested spectators at the quayside carefully noting the name on the label of the crate of whiskey, just to find out where they can be sure of a free drink that night. But at least you can eat like a king on these Norwegian ships. Sardines, brizzling, pickled herring, smoked herring, anchovies, beetroot. Then how about some cold ham, cold tongue, cold roast beef, with half a dozen cheeses and some fruit to follow? Now, there's as fine a meal as any good trencherman could wish. The only snag is that it's breakfast. Norwegians need a good solid base to their day, because they seldom eat lunch at lunchtime. They work right through the day until 4 o'clock and then head home for a sort of dinner lunch. And that's their lot, except for a light snack at bedtime. But anchovies and beetroot at breakfast, that takes a bit of getting used to, especially at sea. To the Norwegians, these 13 steamers of the Coastal Express service are practically a national institution. To the people of the north of Norway, it's even more than that. The Hurtigruten, as they call it, the express service from Bergen to Kirkenes and back, is the lifeline of all the little communities that dot the ragged coastline of Norway deep into the Arctic Circle. It brings them cargo, it brings them mail, but more importantly, it brings them contact with the rest of Norway. In the depth of winter, when the only daylight is a brief midday twilight, the psychological effect of this unfailingly regular service must be immense. It was 72 years ago that the first pioneering service run was made. And for many years that day, the 2nd of July, 1893, was known as the National Day of North Norway, its day of liberation from isolation. 5 of Norway's shipping lines now cooperate to maintain this line, and between them, the 13 steamers cover nearly 1 million miles a year. It's not an easy service to run. The more spectacular the scenery is, the more difficult the waters are to navigate, and each steamer has to carry 2 pilots throughout the whole journey, in addition to the captain and first mate, to steer it through the mass of skerries and islands that fringe the coast. But the Gulf Stream that hugs the coast all the way north keeps the fjords and harbours completely ice-free throughout the winter, and in summer it makes Mediterranean cruising weather for the tourists who come here in their thousands every year. Well, it may not be high summer yet here, but you can certainly call me one of the tourists. I'll be living here on board for the next fortnight, cruising 1,200 miles up this superb and dramatic coastline of Norway. And I'll be reporting each evening from some of the little places that we call in on the way north. It's now some 950 years since a Viking king of Norway sailed his fleet of longships up the River Thames and pulled down London Bridge. And thereby he gave rise to one of the oldest of all our nursery rhymes. London Bridge is falling down. His name was King Olav Haraldsson. And when he was killed in battle later, he was brought here and buried on the far side of the River Nid here in Trondheim. And after miracles were reported at his grave, he was canonized as Saint Olav of Norway. And that's the cathedral that was dedicated to his memory. Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, the finest cathedral in all Scandinavia, even though after 9 centuries of building, it's still unfinished. You see, it's always been a sort of talisman of Norway's history, a barometer in stone of her fluctuating prosperity. And as a result, it's been going up and down like a yo-yo over the centuries as Norway's fortunes rose and fell. For Norway's history never stood still long enough to give time and tranquility for the cathedral to be completed as it had been originally planned. But since she got her independence from Denmark 150 years ago, she's been on the up and up, and so has the Cathedral of Trondheim. And today, 935 years after St. Olav was killed, his cathedral is at long last within appreciable range of being completed, give or take a century or so. None of the medieval archbishops who labored over the cathedral ever lived to achieve its final form. About the year 1300, it was at its nearest to completion. A sumptuous, richly furnished Gothic cathedral, the mecca of pilgrims from all over medieval Europe. But then the yo-yo started going down. Over and over again, the cathedral was wrecked by fire and storm and patched up again. The nave lay in ruins, desecrated by reformers and invaders alike. By the middle of last century, it was a squat, dumpy building, the soaring Gothic architecture reduced to a makeshift huddle. And then, exactly 96 years ago, the last great phase of restoration began. And once again, the cathedral became the center of a community which was almost medieval in its timelessness and scale of values. A whole colony of craftsmen, sculptors and masons, designers and architects moved in and settled down around and near and even on top of the old cathedral. This penthouse workshop, which is perched right on top of the main south tower of the west front, is practically a permanent feature now. The cathedral precincts became a builder's yard. Scaffolding climbed the Gothic walls and clung there like evergreen ivy, weathering as gracefully as the building itself. After the transepts and nave were completed, the great problem was the west front. How was that to be rebuilt? All that remained of it at the time of the restoration was this truncated wall, shored up by ugly brick buttresses. Only 5 crumbling statues remained in their niches. There was also a 17th century copper print with statues in position and a suggestion of another tier of statues above. Apart from this, there was only a jumble of almost unidentifiable debris. Heads, torsos, ruined arched windows, unrecognizable bits of stone tracery that hinted tantalizingly at the Gothic glories of the past. To supply all the statuary required to ornament the exterior, 3 tiers of statues and countless little cameos and heads, there's a full-scale statue factory in the precincts. Next door, you have the plasterers who make molds for the clay models and cast them in plaster. Then the conveyor belt moves on. And in the main hall of the factory, a family of masons painstakingly copy the plaster models in stone, measuring every curve and angle to the fraction of a millimeter. In 1930, an open architectural competition was held, which was won by Helge Thies. And from that time on, architect Thies has been in sole charge of the whole restoration project. Do you think that the complete restoration of the church will ever be finished in your lifetime?
I hope so, because I am an optimist, but it doesn't matter really, because in the great long history of this cathedral, so many building masters have been working, and if it is one or another, it doesn't matter. The cathedral ought to be standing forever, and we to be forgotten.
For 900 years, generations of stonemasons and architects have labored intermittently to bring this cathedral to a state of ultimate perfection. They've all been optimists, just like architect Thies, every single one of them. But the years have merged into decades, and the decades have melted into centuries. There's an air of timelessness about this place that defies the calendar and makes it very hard to believe that this cathedral in Trondheim will ever be fully complete, that the scaffolding will all be stripped away for good. The winter temperatures at this latitude wreak havoc with the fabric of the stonework, and already some of the early restoration work has had to be restored again. And already, too, architect Thies is looking askance at some of his predecessors' work and speaks wistfully of restyling it all afresh. What will the next architect want to do? And the next? And the next? Believe it or not, it's now 7 o'clock in the morning, and we're just past the Arctic Circle. And I've just been issued with a polar passport to prove it. We really are on the threshold of the land of the midnight sun now, and every day the days lengthen dramatically. I woke up this morning at 4 o'clock with this Arctic sun streaming through my porthole. It's very hard to orientate yourself to the days now. It's very hard to sleep. But who wants to sleep in scenery like this? This disorientation becomes more and more acute as the time of the midnight sun approaches. For unfortunately, there are people who want to sleep despite the scenery, but can't. The Norwegians themselves. To them, the midnight sun, with all its spectacular effect, is something they view with vigorous but rather mixed feelings.
I don't like it very much. It makes me a headache, and I can't go to sleep in the evening, and I just feel too excited to go to sleep when it's so light.
Don't you like feeling excited?
No, not at all. Only when it's moonshine. I like dark nights with moonshine and stars, and I just don't like the light nights. I think it's very unnatural in a way.
Well, I like the midnight sun because, well, I like the nature at all, and when I see the midnight sun, I feel very young.
You feel young?
Yes, I do. Because during the winter time it's so dark and icy and cold, you feel old and tired. And when you see the sun again, you must have much sun, all the day and all the night. I think it's very good for us.
The southernmost town in Norway within the Arctic Circle to get the full blaze of the midnight sun is Bodo. And so powerful is the impact of this midsummer phenomenon on the life of Bodo that the unsetting sun has been incorporated into the municipal crest. It simply turns life upside down. The trouble is, it's such a brutally abrupt business. One day it's winter, and next day suddenly it's summer. There's no spring to speak of, no merging and mellowing of seasons. Overnight, it seems, winter is in headlong retreat. The ground thaws under its crust of snow. The crops in the fields are almost hauled out of the ground by the demanding, domineering sun. All the life of summer is crammed into a few hectic, feverish weeks of growth and activity. Throughout the winter, while the fields lie frozen, the people are lethargic, slow. Some, especially farther north, succumb to the darkness sickness when the sun never appears in December and January. Violent bouts of black depression in which the will to do anything, even to get up, is paralyzed. At the other extreme, at high summer, during the 5-week reign of the midnight sun, the will to do nothing is paralyzed, particularly the will to go to bed. May in Bodo is a month of uneasy expectancy, looking forward to the midnight sun with a mixture of ecstasy and apprehension. Are you looking forward to the return of the midnight sun?
Telling me, we are all looking forward to it. Because we had that long, dreary winter, and we are just longing for the midnight sun, for the sun to come. But when the midnight sun comes, we really overdo it. We never seem to get a rest. We have to appreciate that sun the whole day through, and we never get to bed.
Why don't you just use a little willpower and go to bed when it's time to go to bed?
Well, it's really a pity to go to bed when it's lovely like that, you know. Our winter is so dreary. We have to take advantage of the nice summertime we have.
Well, it affects all of us very badly, I'm afraid, but especially the children. You know, when we've brought up 5 children, and I have them from 19 down to 2, it is a terrible job to get them into bed in the evening. Because, well, the sun doesn't go down, and the child would know the difference whether it's day or night. And often in the evening it's the nicest time, because the sun is lovely just down on the horizon, and, well, they just don't feel like going to bed. They want to do all sorts of things, playing with dolls and playing with a ball and soccer and all kinds of things. So we have an awful job getting them into bed.
When do you get them into bed?
Well, it may be around 11, it may be around 12. Sometimes, of course, I'm lucky and I do get them to bed at 9. But then I'm really lucky.
And what about yourself?
Well, we ourselves, we do our daily work the way we should do, but then the evening comes, we still have the sun up there on the sky, and we feel, well, we better take advantage of it, and we start working in the garden and doing our carpets and washing the windows and all kinds of things which actually shouldn't be done at that time of the day, but, well, the sun being there and it being daylight, we feel we have to do it.
It affects my garden. It makes the flowers come out very quickly, so that we have nearly all the flowers at one time, instead of having them spread on a longer period of time. The lilacs and the roses, for instance, are flowering at the same time in July. Well, I should like spring to be a real spring, but we as a rule haven't in the spring at all.
But do you enjoy the midnight sun apart
Oh,
from
I
that?
do. I think it's wonderful. I should like to have it much longer than we actually have it.
All year round?
Well, perhaps. At least the dark time in winter is terrible. It depresses me so much. I'm always very happy in January when the sun starts coming back. It's just one long night, you know, from the middle of December and, well, a little more than the beginning of January. It's hard. You will feel sleepy all the time.
But then you never get any sleep during the summer.
Well, you don't need much sleep, really. When there is always the light, you want to get as much as possible of it. So you don't want to go to sleep, simply. We need just a bare minimum.
The chief symptom of midnight sun fever is compulsive activity. People are seized by an aching restlessness which can only be assuaged by doing something. And when all other activities are exhausted, the housework, the gardening, the aimless strolling round the town, they come up here in the early morning, here to this open-air temple of the midnight sun, and sit here in silent worship as the sun curves down towards the horizon and then clambers steeply away again as if the sea were red hot. And so for 5 long sleepless weeks it goes on here at Bodo. And then one night the sun gratefully lowers itself below the horizon and the midsummer frenzy is over. The people of Bodo sink back with a mixture of relief and regret into a kind of lethargy of autumn, a long hibernation of the soul, until next year when suddenly it's summer and the whole topsy-turvy business starts up all over again. Take a good long look at that razor-sharp ridge of mountain. Can you see about halfway up that curiously shaped outcrop of rock with 2 pinnacles rearing up from it like the horns of some animal? Can you see it? Well, that's what they call the Svalbard goat. And it's an old custom in these parts that when a young man comes to the Lofoten Islands for the first time to try his luck at the great Lofoten spring fisheries, he should take off his cap in homage to the Svalbard goat. Otherwise, he can only expect bad luck. But it's an old custom that's dying out now. The young men don't come swarming to the Lofoten fisheries every spring anymore. Even the Svalbard goat won't bring you fishing luck now, because to all intents and purposes, the great cod spring fisheries of the Lofoten Islands are a thing of the past. The Wall of Islands, that's Lofoten, a great chain of island mountains 125 miles long, thrusting sharp and sheer out of the Arctic seas in a southwesterly arm off the coast of Norway. And every spring before Easter, not so very long ago, the seas off Lofoten boiled with fishing boats. The population of Lofoten doubled as fish workers and traders moved in for a season of the most hectic activity imaginable. But that's all over now. Where once there were 30,000 fishermen taking part in this spring bonanza, now there are only 6,000. The enormous catches of the post-war peak years, 140,000 tons or so, have been dwindling year by year until last year it was only 23,000. This year it was the lowest ever, less than 20,000. And it's brought these 30 fishing stations of Lofoten to the verge of ruin. This one, Kalli, is the worst hit of all. There are only 4 families living here now. Yet once this was the richest fishing ground in all the Lofoten fisheries. Some 500 fishermen used to crowd this fjord every spring. Now not a single fish has been landed here for 2 years. Kalli, as a fishing station, is dead. It's only the large, mature fish that's caught off Lofoten, cod that's 10 years old. It grows up in the Barents Sea and then moves south down to the warm, sheltered waters of Lofoten, only to spawn. That's been its natural life cycle for thousands of years. But in the last decade, intensive modern trawling has been taking a terrible and ever-increasing toll of the young codlings in the Barents Sea. Fewer and fewer cod are surviving to maturity. The Arctic cod is being fished practically out of existence, certainly to the point where it's no longer economic almost to trawl for them. The 4 trawling nations involved, Germany, Britain, Norway, and Russia, are having to intensify their efforts all the time to catch younger and younger fish in order to keep to the annual catch of about 800,000 tons. And a working group of international scientists have now recommended that there must be an immediate limit to the overfishing in the Barents Sea. One of these scientists is Stena Olssen, who's in charge of the Cod Research section at the Institute of Marine Research in Bergen. Now, it looks as if all the fishing nations are cutting one another's throats by this overfishing in the Barents Sea. What can be done about it?
Well, it's a fact. I think, as we say, we're all in the same boat. And the only thing I can say is that you have to fish less and you will get more. Well, that's a bit paradoxical, but that's a fact. And also, if you let the fish live longer until you start fishing, then you will get a larger catch eventually.
Well, how can you just decide to let the fish live longer?
Well, since the Arctic cod is mainly exploited by trawl, you can do that by increasing the mesh size in the trawl. Thereby you let the small fish escape and you take only the larger ones.
Now, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission is meeting in Moscow. What chance do you think there is of the nations agreeing voluntarily to this increase of mesh size?
Well, I don't think I can really say what the chances are, but the fact is that 1964 was a very poor year for all nations. And I think that has made the fisheries administrators in all countries think a bit. But this is not the only thing you can do and the only thing you should do, because if you just regulate your mesh size and do nothing about the fishing intensity, you could very well destroy the benefit you would get by a mesh size increase by increasing your fishing intensity. And I'm afraid that the history so far has shown that this is in fact what's happening. You increase the mesh size, and in order to compensate for the immediate loss, you have to fish harder, and then you just nullify the effect.
The 1965 cod harvest of Lofoten is over now, squeezed almost out of existence by the trawlers of the Barents Sea. But the 1975 harvest is only just starting, right here, because just under the surface of that sea, countless millions upon millions of newly hatched cod fry are beginning their drift to the north. What happens at the Fishery Commission in Moscow next week will decide just whether enough of them will survive to maturity in the Barents Sea and come back here again to spawn in 10 years' time and start another cod bonanza for Lofoten. They call it the capital of North Norway. But despite that important-sounding title, Tromso is at heart still a bit of a frontier town with an air of hasty impermanence about some of its housing. You feel it's a town under constant siege from the Arctic snows. This is a base for the seal catchers, the whalers, the polar bear hunters, tough, hard-living men who range the polar ice from Spitsbergen to Alaska for months on end, then come back here to Tromso with their pockets bulging to live it up a bit. But unfortunately, living it up can be a little hard in a town as sternly prohibitionist as Tromso is. Before the war, there were no licensed restaurants here at all, only a brewery and a state liquor shop. So they bought their bottles of aquavit, their hard stuff, and roistered through the streets of Tromso as drunk as lords, for they had nowhere else to go. Until one day, 28 years ago, the brewery manager, a gentleman with the fine Scots name of Mac, thought of the brilliantly obvious solution. Why not open a pub? And so the only pub in all Scandinavia was born. Mac's Beer Palace, the Earl Hallen, isn't really a pub at all in our sense of the term. It's a Wild West saloon. It's a beer cellar under the Mac brewery itself. And the story of Mac's Beer Palace and the brewery above it is a story in miniature of Norway's long struggle to come to terms with alcohol. A century ago, all Norwegians were permitted by law to make homemade liquor, a fiery form of potato schnapps, a poutine that led to terrible drunkenness. And to offset this, breweries were built to provide a saner alternative. One of them was Mack's Brewery, the most northerly brewery in the world, founded by two immigrant brothers of Scottish-German extraction. And it was this same Scottish-inherited practical instinct that led to the compromise 28 years ago of a controlled beer-drinking pub. It started up in the teeth of violent opposition from the prohibitionists, as you can imagine. And since it's a pub, and not a licensed restaurant of the kind that have mushroomed in Norway since the war, its opening hours are from 9 in the morning until 5, only 5, in the evening. The only drink you can get in this pub is beer. Wines and spirits of any kind are absolutely taboo. You can get two kinds of beer here, though. You can get the rather weak Pilsner beer, which is served in all the licensed restaurants, but the great attraction is the stronger export or Bock beer, which is up to 7%. And to stoke up your thirst, you take a packet not of potato crisps, but of hard, dried fish. It takes a little bit of getting used to, actually. It's rather like chewing on a piece of wood. They say it's very good for the teeth, though, if any of your teeth survive. It's very much a tough man's pub, this. Women aren't exactly banned, but they're certainly frowned upon. And as an ultimate deterrent to women, the only toilet here is men only. It's very much a private, male world, a world with its own rules and regulations. And since the only pub in Scandinavia happens to be situated in the strongest prohibition area in the north of Norway, the discipline here has to be as ruthless as it is on a sealing expedition, for instance, when mere survival depends on unquestioning obedience to these rules. And breaches of the rules are dealt with here just as summarily. Here, the manager, Olaf Andreasson, who has been boss here ever since the pub opened, has absolute authority. He is king. His word is law. And his authority is based on the most terrible punishment ever invented by a humane society, outlawry. Anyone who gets drunk and makes trouble is thrown out and then exiled from Max. Exiled for at least 6 months. But the worst offense in the book is to try to doctor the beer with a furtive drop of spirits. The penalty for that is instant banishment of at least 1 year without appeal. And if a customer happens to come in with a bottle he's just bought for home consumption, he's careful to hand it over to the manager first, like checking in his pistol. But this is not merely willful managerial tyranny. It's enlightened despotism that is cheerfully accepted by society. For the men of Tromso are proud of Mack's pub and grateful for it. And banishment from Max is not only a dreaded deprivation, it's the worst social disgrace imaginable. Mack's Beer Palace, the only pub in Scandinavia. This is a place that men dream of in the long Arctic nights on the polar ice. To them, the greatest nightmare is to come back here and find the door inexorably shut in their faces. There are about 20 men sitting out their exile from Mack's Beer Palace in Tromso right now. Strong men have been known to go on their knees and burst into tears, begging the manager to be allowed to come back to Mack's Beer Palace. All that for a drink of beer and a bite of dried fish. By a rather macabre stroke of irony, the only building in Hammerfest left standing when the Germans razed the town to the ground 20 years ago was that one, the mortuary chapel. The Germans were falling back through Finnmark before the avenging Russian armies, scorching the earth behind them as they went. Every town, every village was obliterated. Every home was burned to the ground. Every piece of equipment, every installation was destroyed. Every single family they could find was evacuated. And here in Hammerfest, the most northerly town in the world, the county town of the province of Finnmark, the Germans did an exceptionally thorough job, apart from that mortuary chapel. But there was one thing that they couldn't destroy, and that was the will of the people to live here where they belonged. It's a little difficult to imagine at first glance why anyone in his sane senses should ever wish to live up here on this inhospitable coast by his own choice. The winter is a long and deadly tedium of darkness with no sun visible at all for 3 months. Look at the headlong depopulation of the Scottish Highlands and Islands and of the remoter areas of the north of England. Surely here, where the conditions are infinitely more difficult, depopulation would be utterly impossible to check, even with the help of an army. Or so you'd think. But the fact is that the trend has not only been checked, it's been reversed. The population of North Norway is going up, not down, and going up pretty fast. All along this bleak coast, impossible little fishing villages are burgeoning into towns. Here in North Norway, the government has achieved a minor economic miracle. The devastation by the Germans inspired a new national attitude towards the north, new development policies designed to give the north a modern industrial economy. Millions of pounds have been spent on harnessing the powerful rivers of North Norway to provide plentiful and cheap hydroelectricity, which makes it economic to start up industries with exceptionally high power consumption. An integrated transport system has been developed, and the backbone of this system, stiffened by government subsidies, has been the Hurtigruten, the daily coastal express service on which I've been travelling north for the last few days. This is the lifeline. This is how the Norwegians of the north get their fresh food supplies, their machinery, their mail, their constant contact with the south. Without it, they say, North Norway would wither away. Subsidized ferries ply the long northern fjords to connect with the Hurtigruten from the interior. New roads, railways and airfields ensure that the remotest community is never completely cut off. Tempting tax incentives encourage industry to move north instead of expanding in the south. All profits are totally tax-free if they're invested as development capital in the north of Norway. And a North Norway Development Fund was set up, which proved to be the most important single act in the government's policy towards the rehabilitation of the north. It started with capital of £5 million and complete discretion to use it as the board thought best, as low-interest loans or bank guarantees to local enterprises, or for buying shares in keystone local industries. Anyone with a good idea and sufficient initiative can get fund backing. And the first town to benefit from the fund 13 years ago was Hammerfest. 13 years ago, a chocolate firm in Oslo with a few million kroner in its asset sheets decided to take advantage of the tax incentives and the development fund loans and set up a plant in Hammerfest. Not a chocolate factory, but a fish factory. Hammerfest has always been a fairly important but small fishing town. But since the fish freezing plant was started in 1952, the population has almost doubled, from 4,000 to well over 7,000. The 25,000 tons of fish it handles each year provide work for 600 local fishermen and a score of trawlers. It's the largest and almost the only industrial employer in Hammerfest, with 700 workers of all kinds. It's Hammerfest's main source of income, its economic mainstay, and the Development Fund has poured almost £500,000 into it, the biggest loan on its books. Without it, Hammerfest would revert to a dwindling fishing village again. The general principle behind the government policies is to create growth towns on the coast that will act as human dams. As the people gradually leave the interior and come trickling down to the coast, the towns are there to catch them before they're dissipated in the drifting current to the southern cities. And these human catchment areas create new centres of energy that are just as important to Norway's future as the hydroelectric schemes themselves. The new energy shows itself in a birth rate that's higher than anywhere else in Norway. But there's a human problem too. The most gifted youngsters have to go south to university, to Oslo or Bergen or Trondheim, and very, very few of them ever come back. Without a larger range of industries, Hammerfest is too small to create the sort of urban culture that these children will grow up to expect. There's always difficulty in getting doctors and teachers and dentists to come and live here. Living on top of the world doesn't necessarily make you feel that way all the time. But look at the credit side and compare it with the human wastage of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Here in Hammerfest, despite the terrible difficulties of the climate, despite the devastation of the war, the population is steadily rising. The North Norway Development Fund has been so successful that it's been vastly expanded into a development fund for Norway as a whole. And it's all based on a simple, powerful principle, that people have the right to live and prosper where they belong if they want to, and that ultimately the economy of the whole nation will benefit thereby. That's what I call progress. And if it works here in Hammerfest, I reckon it could work just about anywhere. The coastal steamer calls in at Vardo for only an hour or so late in the evening. And at that time of night and in this kind of weather, Vardo is a pretty quiet sort of a town. But there was a night in Vardo once when the champagne flowed in rivers, when the whole town was en fete, because Fridtjof Nansen, the great Arctic explorer, was leaving Vardo the next morning and striking north to seek his immortality in the polar ice 72 years ago. With him went 12 men on a mission that the rest of the world said was doomed to disaster, a quest to find a way across the top of the world through the polar ice. Nansen reckoned that the polar ice must drift in a current right across the North Pole, and he determined that he would put a boat into the ice to follow that drift deliberately. The world called him a fool, but the world reckoned without the fantastic strength and endurance of one of the finest little boats ever built, a boat as deservedly legendary as the Kon-Tiki itself, the little wooden schooner Fram. Fram in Norwegian means forward, and no boat ever lived up to her name so well. She's an astonishing little boat, the Fram, and not surprisingly, the sea-loving Norwegians have built her a museum all to herself. She was designed specifically as a boat for ice. She was built to be stronger than iron and slippier than soap, so that when the Arctic ice closed around her, she would slide upwards out of its grasp instead of being crushed. The whole hull is rounded and smoothed off to offer the ice no projections on which to grip. Nansen designed her rather like a rugby ball, 1/3 as broad as she's long, and he built her of the strongest, toughest wood in the world. Her hull is 30 inches thick, 2 thick layers of oak with an outer layer of greenheart from British Guiana, wood so heavy and strong that it sinks. Below deck, she's a maze of crisscross timber and iron. The whole hull is buttressed by a forest of living wood, mighty timber beams, not shaped like this by the carpenter, but hand-picked from the forest specially because it happened to grow precisely in the right shape for greater strength. It's like being inside the ribs of a whale, and the whole thing is reinforced by knees and braces and stanchions of iron. This ship, this Fram, was designed to be the toughest nut that the ice had ever tried to crack. Ooh. I wonder how often Nansen did that coming through that door. He was an enormous man, 6'3" tall. In fact, the quarters that they all lived in were incredibly confined. All the 13 men messed in this one saloon. Nansen himself had his own cabin, so did his 3 officers, but the crew had to sleep 4 to a room, and a very small room it was too. But despite these confined quarters, they were an incredibly happy bunch of men. In the evenings, they turned this saloon into a concert hall. People played the violin and the harmonica. They even had 2 musical boxes with them. It's a bit out of tune now, but it probably worked all right 60 or 70 years ago. There were 12 tunes to each musical box, so that meant they had 24 tunes to choose from. This, then, was the squat little tub, 420 tons in all, that practically every polar expert in the world was convinced would be Nansen's tomb. They sailed off along the north coast of Russia towards the new Siberian islands where the Jeanette had gone down. On September the 22nd, 1893, at a latitude of 77 degrees 44 minutes north, the Fram nosed away into the polar ice and yielded herself to it, and the great drift began. But by the end of the first winter, it was clear that the drift was not fast enough. By the end of the second year, they were still 400 miles away from the North Pole, and Nansen reckoned it would take anything up to 10 years for the Fram ever to reach there, if she could at all. And so Nansen decided that he would head for the North Pole on foot with one companion, Hjalmar Johansen. He reckoned that the journey would take about a month, and then a month back, and he would rejoin the Fram as she was drifting southward out of the ice. And so during the second part of the second winter, he and his men working on this deck started preparing for this fantastic overland expedition to the North Pole. They made the skis, they made 6 sledges which they filled with provisions, and they made homemade kayaks, 2 kayaks which Nansen had learnt all about during his explorations in Greenland. They're made of a bamboo framework covered with sailcloth and bound with tarred rope, light enough to be carried, and they were drawn on sledges by the teams of dogs. They weren't exactly waterproof, so each kayak was supplied with its own homemade pump, which the paddler had to work. And with this sort of equipment, Nansen and Johansen set off for the North Pole alone. The ice is not a smooth plateau. It's an architectural jungle piled high with tenements and bridges and enormous heaps of rubble. Through this wilderness, Nansen and Johansen, the greatest living athlete in Norway, dragged their sledges and kayaks. The dogs gave up. Johansen nearly died of exhaustion. Nansen pitched a tent for him and struggled on alone. He reached latitude 86 degrees 14 minutes north, 150 miles farther than any man had ever been before. But he still had another 300 miles to go. He stopped, gazed at the fearful, endless mass of ice ahead of him, slowly ate 3 lumps of sugar, and turned back. But the journey back became even more of a nightmare, for now, through exhaustion, they made the only real blunder of the expedition. They forgot to wind their chronometers, and they were lost, hopelessly and utterly lost. Then, as the Fram went on calmly drifting in the sluggish current of ice with her 11 prisoners, the 2 men on foot had to spend a winter holed up in a stone cabin they built for themselves. And next spring, they set off across Franz Josef Land. And there, unbelievably, was a British exploring party led by Frederick Jackson. The British ferried them back to Vardø, back to the place where they'd set out more than 3 years earlier. No one knew what had become of Fram. Both Fram and Nansen had been given up for lost long ago. But then, a few days later, the miracle happened, a stretch of coincidence almost too good to be true. A telegram came to say that Fram, too, had just arrived in Norway. She had shaken herself free of the Arctic ice just north of Spitsbergen on the very same day that Nansen had stepped ashore at Vardø on August the 13th, 1896. The ice pressure had been tremendous, but Fram had survived the impossible. And now Fram and Nansen were reunited, and their polar epic was over. But Fram's story wasn't over yet. She had 2 more historic voyages to make. One was to the Northwest Passage, and another one to the Antarctic, when Roald Amundsen just managed to beat Captain Scott to the South Pole in December 1911. And just as she had been farther north than any boat had ever been before, now she had gone the farthest south. It's not a bad record for a tub of a boat that everyone said wouldn't even survive the sea, never mind the ice. It's the end of the sea road, the end of the 1,200-mile cruise on the coastal steamer service from Bergen in the south to Kirkenes in the far, far north. This is where the steamer stops, turns and heads back for Bergen. Kirkenes is the land's end of Norway, a brand new town of some 5,000 people, rather proud of the fact that it had to be totally rebuilt after the war because, apart from Malta, it was the most bombed place in the world, or so they claim. But it has another claim to distinction, because Kirkenes is right next door to Russia. The signpost says, "To the Soviet Commonwealth." And the Soviet Commonwealth starts just a few yards away on the other side of this wire mesh gate with the rather inadequate padlock on it. I'm sorry I can't take you through the gate, because pointing a camera at Russia from here is absolutely forbidden. You can point it along Russia, beside Russia, and in front of Russia, but not at Russia. And up there, on that hillside, about 1,000 yards away, there's a Russian guard post, which has a pair of binoculars permanently mounted and manned, which is glaring right at us at this moment, which is a little disconcerting. On my right-hand side, there's a Norwegian guard post. That also has a pair of mounted binoculars, but I understand that they're not very good binoculars. The Russian binoculars, on the other hand, are very good indeed. A few days ago, a German tourist managed to sneak some snapshots of Russia from here, Within half an hour, the Russians had hoisted a red flag which showed that they wanted to parley with the Norwegian guards, and had presented a written formal complaint about the incident, which included the actual make of camera that the German had been using at 1,000 yards range. Ever since the war, the Russians and the Norwegians have been manning the 122 miles of frontier between their two countries. The Russians glowering suspiciously at the west through their powerful binoculars, the Norwegians shrugging their shoulders good-humouredly at the absurdity of this rather pointless border patrol. Because anyone who wants to slip across into Russia on skis can do so any night at all he likes, and telltale ski tracks show that this certainly does happen. But there's never been any trouble here at this border post, and that's why the Russians call this area the Valley of Peace. There's never very much traffic here either. The padlock on that gate doesn't get opened very often. The Cold War, as well as the climate, have seen to it that this border remains very frozen indeed. But now, suddenly, this spring, a big thaw is setting in. The most important factor in the thaw is going to be tourism. The Russian authorities have just agreed to throw this gate open with a vengeance this summer and allow in a horde of tourists. Tourists, what's more, without visas or passports. You see, over there, the Russians have a little town that they're very proud of. It's a sort of sister town to Kirkenes called Boriskleb. The story goes that centuries ago, two Russian princes called Boris and Kleb committed a murder and vowed in penance that they would go as far north as they possibly could and start a religious foundation for their sins. That was the start of the town of Borisklebs, and the Russians have just completed a very extensive restoration job on it. They really are rather sold on this town. When the boundary between Norway and Russia was being fixed about a century ago, the natural place for it to be was up the river Pastvik, which flows directly north. But so keen were the Russians to include Boriskleb within their territory that they pushed the boundary across the river, and then in exchange they gave Norway an enormous chunk of Russia along the north coast as compensation. This is the town that the Russians are so keen to have tourists see without visas or passports. Now, this summer, this rather un-Russian concession is going to apply only to Scandinavian tourists and only to the town of Boriskleb. But next year it's hoped it's going to apply to tourists of all nationalities, and they'll be allowed to move much further afield. Meanwhile, for at least a year, this is the end of the Norwegian line for all British tourists. In my own case, on the other hand, there are occasions when it's quite useful to be a Scandinavian. From Norway, farvel.